So Danielle, it is 10:30, and we try at least to run a pretty tight ship. And I note that we have a good group, and a couple or so will join. But I think it's good to be punctual. And actually, we do these things crisp and with a hard stop in 1 hour in 60 minutes from now. And Danielle, Danielle is our associate publisher who kindly hosts and leads and organizes us on these things. Danielle, for everybody who's on, could you just once through read the list of attendees actually present or expected to join? I think you can leave out institutional affiliations and just names, please.
Sure, absolutely. So we have the TAI team. There's 7 of us: Charles, Jeff, Demir, Sean, Aaron, Dan, and Cassie, our latest intern. Then we have lots of friends and family: Craig Kennedy, Arch Puddington, Gabe Schoenfeld, Gary Schmidt, Christopher Harrison, Charles Dunce, Luke Phillips, Martin Skold, Nicholas Iluzzi, David Kraemer, Eliora Kotz, Ralph Jorvich, Walt Hudson, William Hill, Bill Clifford, Rich Kraemer, Giselle Donnelly, Ellen Bork, and please forgive me if I've forgotten anyone, but also feel welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat. And if you have questions during the course of the conversation, please feel welcome to use the raise hand function or message Jeff or myself privately, or everyone in the chat. Feel welcome.
Great, Danielle, thank you for that. Very nice introduction. I see a couple additional friends have joined, and wonderful and welcome. So here's what we want to do. Here's what I want to do. And Ashley, it's your show. So Ashley does not need a long and he deserves a long and fancy introduction, but I'm gonna, for sake of time, not give him one today. But I'm going to tell him what virtually all of you know, that he's had a distinguished career as a research scholar and writer. He's worked at high levels in the United States government, in the White House, and as an advisor at the State Department, as an advisor to a U.S. ambassador in New Delhi. He's worked at the RAND Corporation. He's with the Carnegie Endowment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So forgive me, Ashley, if I don't go on further than that. But I do want to say you've done a real service to all of us, I think, in a fine piece of work published about a week ago. So it's fresh, and we sent it around to everybody for the help me, National Bureau Asian Research. And I think for those of you who have looked at the article, it begins by saying, my words, Ashley, not your eloquent words, we're all awake now. We understand that China poses a long-term strategic threat in more ways than one. And now Charles Davidson, our publisher, and I were speaking this morning with our team. You do a kind of SWOT analysis for business, you know? So considering this, what are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And you delve with considerable detail into what our weaknesses are that we need to consider and fix, or what our vulnerabilities are. I'll stop with that. I think it's a very rich and helpful article. Ashley, we'd like to hear from you about that. We'd like to hear about anything else that is on your mind, and then we'll have a good and full round of discussion and questions and comments. So Ashley, the American Interest welcomes you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to actually see you after so many years. I remember the times when we used to be on the McCain Express, going to Munich on those late night flights. But it's great that we've reconnected, and I'm delighted to actually speak to the group that you've assembled here this morning. You know, I wrote this piece more in anguish than in anger, because I was really worried that we were missing important elements with respect to long-term competition with China. And the piece basically makes 3 points that I want to just reprise quickly before we get into the discussion. First, the pandemic is obviously a huge human tragedy on a global scale. We know that, you know, I don't need to sort of reiterate that at any length. But the important thing that I think we risk losing sight of is that it is going to have a huge impact on our capacity to mobilize and produce national power. The declines in GDP that are predicted as a result of the pandemic are going to be quite significant. And the character of the recovery that we are likely to enjoy, if and when that comes, is not at all clear at this point. Obviously, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side, we've made huge interventions, unprecedented in sort of modern American history. But it's not clear to me that that will be sufficient to get us back on the recovery path anytime soon. We have to keep our fingers crossed. But I wanted to highlight two consequences as a result of this reality. The first is that non-defense demands in the US economy are going to grow as a result of all the efforts that we've made to manage the pandemic. And these non-defense demands are only going to grow in intensity even after the pandemic is sort of resolved, assuming we can do that. And that is going to have clearly an impact on the defense budget, which is that part that is important to us for our hard power, and so on and so forth. So that's a dilemma that is going to become even more acute, the trade-off between non-defense demands and defense demands in the years ahead. If we looked at the financial crisis of 2008, the hits that the defense budget took in the years following were significant. It affected our ability to prepare for great power competition in very serious ways. And I fear that the constraints on the defense budget will be even more significant as a result of the pandemic. The second element, which gives me a real reason for pause, is what economists are sort of flagging as the threat of secular stagnation. And this has to do with long-term trends in the US economy. It has to do with demographics, it has to do with education, and so on and so forth. And that really has consequences for our capacity to maintain long-term power. And I think the pandemic will only accentuate those challenges. So the first point was simply that the pandemic is going to levy real threats to the material foundations of our power, and we need to pay attention to that dimension going forward. The second big point that I was trying to make is that US society, which is a remarkable sort of social phenomenon, which is highly decentralized, is not designed to cope with crises like a pandemic. Because the very character of that decentralization does not allow the US as a country to deal with a crisis that produces huge negative externalities that cross sort of state boundaries, state society boundaries, and what have you. And that means that dealing with a crisis like this puts a premium on really having an effective and a competent state. And the argument that I make in the paper is that, it's gratifying that there are different elements of the American state that are still in good shape and that have performed remarkably well. And I would identify state governments, the Federal Reserve, and others as being examples of such effectiveness. But I think we have really been failed by executive authority. The failure of the president to sort of lead a coherent national response is something that bodes ill for long-term competition. Now, thankfully, we don't have presidents for life. There will be rotations at some point in the future. But it's important to keep in mind that when we are dealing with problems that don't involve private goods, when you're dealing with sort of collective problems, the need for effective state capacity becomes really significant. And it's unfortunate, in my view, that this is where we seem to have failed. The record of the last few months is any indication. This has one important consequence for, again, the issue of long-term national power. And that has to do now with the decisions that we're going to make with respect to reopening. And if we end up making these decisions in a haphazard fashion without due weight to science and the evidence, then my fears are that we would actually retard the recovery that could otherwise occur. And reinforce our capacity to build our national strength to deal with the long-term challenge. So the failures of state competency could have long-term effects beyond just the longevity of the current president or the current leadership in political office. The third point that I think is worth emphasizing is that the pandemic, at least so far, has demonstrated a real paucity of US international leadership. And to my mind, that is really tragic because, what is at risk is really the character of the world that the US built since 1945, and which I deeply believe, serves not just global interests, but fundamentally American interests. The failure in particular to mobilize our alliances and develop collective alliance responses, both to the medical challenges and to the political challenges, I think is really unfortunate because it undermines the perception of US power, the effectiveness and the competence with which we wield power. And that has consequences for our ability to mobilize the global coalition that we are going to need if we have to deal with China. Now, part of this leadership deficit has understandably been caused by the shock of the pandemic. I mean, that is completely natural. But if you look at the 9/11 example, the US, even in the face of tremendous sort of national trauma, did quite well in terms of mobilizing an international coalition to deal with the threat of terrorism, barely 2 decades ago. And there was no reason why we could not have responded similarly to deal with the threat of the pandemic. Now, there are two sub-points here. One is the question of leadership and the need to sort of orchestrate, mobilize coalitions to deal with the pandemic in its medical dimensions. But the second is simply the politics, and in particular, the need to show solidarity with our own allies. Because as I look to the future, I see a future where US relative power will either stay stable or gradually decline. I mean, most of the projections of the global economy seem to suggest that. But that only makes it even more important that the US sort of double down on its alliances, because its alliance partners still constitute the bulk of the global GDP. And if we can mobilize and strengthen those alliance relationships, then the US can protect the international order, even if its own national product is actually diminishing in some global sense. And so the need to sort of maintain alliance cohesion and the need to invest and keep investing in our alliances as solutions to, as collective devices for dealing with rising Chinese power becomes even more important. And I think we sort of blew this one in the way that we've managed our alliances. Let me end by just making one other point that sometimes gets lost. I mean, in providing this somewhat pessimistic sort of assessment of how we've done so far, I don't mean to, suggest a counsel of despair. I don't think, American hegemony is over. I don't think American primacy is sort of a thing of the past. We have extraordinary strengths, our national wealth, for one, capacity for innovation, resourcefulness of the population, all that. But in order to be able to mobilize these resources, we do need sort of sensible and conscious leadership. And that is something that I hope we can recover after we sort of overcome the current shocks. And we will certainly need that leadership if we have to protect the order that we built and sustain our capacity to compete with China in a serious way. Because whatever else the Chinese may lack, they do have a leadership that is very conscious of the need to maintain their power and to create circumstances that are favorable for that regime's survival. So there is enough instrumental rationality there to give us a good run for our money. So let me end there, Jeff, and I really want to hear from our colleagues who have kindly taken the time to come together this morning.
Well, thank you, Ashley. That was just outstanding and succinct and rich with ideas and material. I want to take the liberty of asking a first question. So when I read your piece, I must confess, and you alluded to this, I must confess, I wasn't sure at the end whether I found it sobering or a bit of a downer, and whether I was left pessimistic. I'm going to say sobering. And let me mention two bits from the article, and I'd love your reply. One is, and you've mentioned this in your remarks this morning, that, as I think you put in the piece, the rise of populism in the United States means calls and demands from parts of the electorate to reallocate resources toward domestic needs, and that means away from international obligations or demands. That's the one piece. And the second piece is, you noted, I think with some sympathy, that there's a move now and a development now toward returning or reestablishing critical supply chains from abroad and from China back into the United States. But you also noted that while what we've done, maybe you call it unrestrained globalism, has been problematic, reversing this may lead to some inefficiencies and maybe even lower growth in the near term. So if I have you right, if I summarized you correctly, those are descriptions of problems. How does one start managing them? Because they're real and they're compelling. And if we're to engage with these challenges and threats, bills have to be paid and initiatives have to be funded. Talk through what that looks like in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, the kind of leadership, the kind of conversation that needs to be had with policymakers and with American citizens and voters.
So on the very first issue, on the challenges posed by populism, right? I don't think we are going to be able to run away from the fact that we are going to have a very massive expansion of the welfare state in the next few years, simply because we have to help our citizens cope with the ravages, the economic ravages of the pandemic. And this is going to have costs on our capacity to operate externally in the world. We need to have that discussion about the trade-offs. And that discussion, I don't think, has occurred yet, understandably, because we are still dealing with the pandemic itself. And so the knock-on consequences for America's role in the world are things that are sort of further down the line. It's the same issue with the supply chains. We know that we will need greater resiliency. And greater resiliency will impose penalties on our capacity to grow in ways that we have in the past. And this will involve trade-offs. So that discussion between, what kind of a premium we are going to put on maximal growth versus what kind of a premium we are going to put on building safeguards is really the national conversation that we have to begin. And it's not a conversation, obviously, that's going to occur in a sort of, in one spasm. It's going to occur in bits and pieces. But I think we have to look for ways to deal with the immediate challenge while preparing for a period of slowing growth over the longer term, which to my mind seems to be the only logical inference I can make from current trends.
Actually, thank you. The floor is now open. I'm looking for text messages in hand, so when I don't see them, Danielle, help me and shout out. Who would like to be next in the conversation? I think I've got David Kraemer and then Charles Dunst. David?
Thanks very much, Jeff. Ashley, thanks very much. I will confess differently than Jeff. I will confess that I have not read your article, but I will after this. So apologies for that, but thank you for your comments this morning. Can I ask you to look at this in the relative perspective? Is China going to be in a position where it can bounce back more quickly? at least on the official statistics level, it doesn't seem to have suffered the same number of cases and fatalities as the United States. But presumably they're not out of the woods yet. So when you talk about American power and influence and ability to project and everything, how is it relative to China, given the impact the pandemic is having on China? When I look at Russia, a country I know better, the combination of the energy crisis and the pandemic, and I would argue failed leadership on the part of Putin in responding to this, can play both ways. It can lead to Putin looking to deflect attention from the failures of the Russian state in handling this and projecting onto others, or it could impinge on his abilities to project overseas. So I'd be curious, looking at it from a relative perspective, the United States and China in that sense, and anything on Russia that you might offer, particularly even if you might, the Russia-China relationship emerging from this. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I think it's hard to get a full measure of what is happening in China because of both the regime's interest in sort of, holding back on data that might help us understand this. But when one looks at sort of international assessments of Chinese economic bounce back, most of the international assessments from sources that I would trust, US government agencies, private institutions that look at the Chinese economy, seem to suggest that they will be able to make a faster comeback than the United States. That, however, is not the full answer, because in comparison to the US, China simply does not have the depth of resources to translate that comeback into long-term sustainability of national power. So the reason I wrote my piece was we have these advantages in terms of depth of capacity, but I want to be sure that we don't lose those advantages because of bad public policy. Now, the Chinese, I think, will be able to do better mitigation of the medical consequences of the pandemic than we have been able to do. And to that degree, they have that advantage because it allows them to think more seriously about power accumulation and be more effective in terms of power accumulation, at least for a while. But the long-term challenges that China faces with respect to demography, with respect to per capita income, are still serious. The brittleness of the regime is still a serious problem. And none of those problems are going away simply because China manages the economic recovery better or faster. But we can make our lives a lot more difficult if we don't engineer a recovery that is sensible. So it may well be the case that over the longer term, we still win this fight because there's still a huge asymmetry in terms of national capabilities between China and the United States. But we don't have to make things more difficult for ourselves by our inability to manage the recovery efficiently. And this is where, to my mind, presidential leadership really begins to matter, because one of the things that the piece sort of emphasizes is that pandemics do require sort of centralized responses. You cannot hope that the market mechanism by itself will sort of deal with the challenge. And that's really the long-term question. With respect to Russia, I'm very pessimistic because Russian society has huge vulnerabilities, and the Russian state and its brittleness and Putin's own response so far has only magnified those vulnerabilities. So I'm actually far more pessimistic about Russia than I am about China on this question.
David, thank you. And Ashley, thank you very much. I have next, we have a pretty good long list now. We try to work everybody into the conversation. I have next Charles Dunst. Charles, you were kind enough to write your question, but I still think it's fair and better if you pose it than having me read it. Having said that, be succinct.
I believe Charles might be having some camera and mic issues. Would you?
Then then we'll come back to him in a moment, and I'm going to go to Truman. Truman Anderson, are you there? All right, we'll come back to Truman. How about Martin Skold?
Hi, yeah, I'm here. So I guess my question is, how's this look from the other side? There's a possibly apocryphal quote attributed to the British general in the Pacific during World War II, where he says something to the effect of, if you ever find yourself feeling despondent in combat, remember the enemy may feel even worse. I'm wondering if we take as axiomatic that China is trying to push us off our global perch, and we look at this holistically, so not just in terms of, as we so often do when we talk about security issues, start counting tanks or carriers or F-35s. If we look at this more in terms of politics or China's ability to extend its economic influence, or the message that it's sending, or any of those other areas of framework in kind of three-dimensional terms, what could they do right now against the weaknesses that you've identified in us? Or do they have it as badly as we do?
I think there are two paths to that answer. The first path has to do with what is the impact of the pandemic on their material capabilities and their ability to recover fast enough so as to continue that trajectory that they were on prior to the pandemic, which is still slowing, but relatively high rates of growth compared to the United States. So that's one part of the question. What is the impact on the material capability? And the second is, what is the impact on China's own reputation for providing an alternative to the United States as a leader in the international system? I think the questions about the impact of the pandemic on China's material capability are still open. I think, as I said, in response to David, they will do better than we can in the short run, but the long-term challenges on the material side are still significant and they're not going away. On the second issue, which is China's capacity to show itself as an alternative model or as an alternative focal point for global leadership, I think the Chinese have blown it. And they've blown it partly because they reached too far too fast. Their response with respect to information regarding the origins of the pandemic, the management of the pandemic, the transmission of the pandemic in the early weeks was just deplorable. And what they did in the aftermath, which is pretending that somehow, they have been far more effective than other states. Their sort of pathetic public diplomacy efforts at, sending medical supplies to other countries and so on and so forth in order to buy both sort of favorable opinion and possibly loyalty. I think all that has backfired. And the Chinese efforts in Europe are a very good example of that fact. So at the moment, I don't think China looks like that sort of shining city on the hill alternative to the United States. But this is a long game, and we have to see what kind of a recovery China can mount, as it comes back into this game, particularly if it can show that its own economy begins to recover much faster and more sensibly than ours may in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Martin. David Kraemer, if you have something right now that's on point with the current conversation, I'm going to bring you back in. If it's not, and it's a different subject, what's all related, then I'd come back to you in 10 or 12 minutes. I'm giving you the call on that.
Different subject, so I'll come back later. Thanks.
Okay, and we will be back to you. So, Charles Dunst, I think your microphone is functioning. We're back with you, and I'm encouraging everybody to be succinct in the ensuing 31 minutes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I managed to get my mic to work if everyone can hear me. So thank you, Ashley, for the article and for the talk. I guess my question is, how do we kind of approach this idea that throughout kind of much of the global South, where China is obviously wielding substantial diplomatic and economic power, how do we address the fact that many people, many citizens in those regions are not actually pro-China? I think it's something we overlook, that if you go throughout Southeast Asia, you may say that, Cambodia and the Philippines are China aligned, but in reality, if you actually talk to, or even look at polling of those countries, they're overwhelmingly in favor of the US, even though that has declined under President Trump. So I'm wondering if you think under a President Biden, for example, does the US kind of experience a mass uptick in its effort to kind of retain influence in the global South, or have we kind of lost it already?
I'm actually far more optimistic about this issue than I am on many others. And I think there are two elements that will make a difference. First is we have to re-engage with active diplomacy and an active presence in all of these countries. As you mentioned, after about 20 years of extensive Chinese investment and presence in the global South, the pushback towards China is now underway. Countries are beginning to realize that China was not, this force of national liberation that it sort of pretends to be. China's interests in investing in these countries are driven by its own sort of narrow ambitions. And so there is a degree of suspicion, resentment, even animosity towards China in many of the countries of the global South. The problem is that these countries don't have alternatives, because very often we have not chosen to be present, either in terms of diplomacy or in terms of economics or in terms of our broader power capabilities. So we have to address those deficits in terms of engagement and presence. And it is possible, in fact, it's likely that if you get a different kind of administration, in fact, a more traditional Republican administration, the US could go back to doing that, with a great deal of effectiveness. The second element, and the pandemic actually offers us this opportunity in a strange way, is to demonstrate that the US is still the fountainhead of global innovations. Because if we, end up being the source that produces either the first vaccine or the first effective treatment to the virus, believe me, before you know it, the whole global community is going to come gravitating back to the United States, because that's where, the solution to the pandemic is going to be found. So in that sense, our economic strengths, our innovation strengths are enduring. And if we are lucky enough to be able to, strike success on this count, we can once again become, the provider of choice to many of these countries. So I don't believe, this war is lost at all. But I do think it requires, significant sort of foreign policy attention. We've got to make this a priority. And unfortunately, we haven't quite done that as well as we should in recent years.
Very good. Thank you both. So if Truman Anderson rejoins, then he's going to have the word. I'm going to go now to William Hill. Bill, I see you there. You have the floor.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much. And actually, thank you very much. I read your article, your piece when Carnegie distributed it, and I was very impressed. It's one of the best I've seen of the genre now coming out of what's the world going to be like after COVID. And I agree very much with your comments on the need for and the lingering receptivity for U.S. leadership. But I wanted to raise three quick areas where the debate is whether the pandemic will accentuate and help continue ongoing current trends or change them. First, in the economy, there doesn't seem to be a change, at least looking at it now. The dollar, of the loss of the dollar as the currency of global settlements. And doesn't that give the U.S. still a real advantage in terms of recovering? On the defense budget, there's a significant debate going on now within U.S. military, DoD, that it's not the amount that we're spending, but we're continuing to spend money on the wrong things. And therefore, the fact that we spend more than China is not material. It's that we're funding legacy systems that are increasingly developed or vulnerable to the Chinese. And is there any sign the pandemic will change this? And finally, you have very good points on competency in government. And the question is, if a new administration comes in, is this going to change something that one can argue, and people like Michael Lewis have, that the Tea Party before and movements and that coalesced in the Tea Party had been attacking expertise and competence and government by elites for some time, and that simply getting rid of Trump is not necessarily going to remove this element in American politics, especially if the Republicans continue control of the Senate. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, on those.
So let me start in reverse. The issues of competency, to my mind, as you point out, have actually deeper roots than just the president. And that is the worrying thing for me, beyond just, elections and so on and so forth. I mean, one way or the other, we will be done with Trump, if not in a few months, in a few years. But if we lose that Enlightenment sensibility in the United States, that is what I fear. And when I talk about systemic rationality in the article, I always thought of the United States as being this exemplar of Enlightenment rationality, where we sort of, Max Weber used to talk of systemic rationality in our institutions, in our capacity to mobilize resources, and so on and so forth. And the trends that you allude to are things that are more deeply rooted, and unless we can evolve away from those more pernicious elements, the issues of competency will remain with us long after this president leaves office. And that for me is frightening, because if we lose our capacity to act in ways that are simply sensible, we lose our capacity to lead. We will not be able to maintain leadership if we end up becoming victims to the kinds of forces that you alluded to. This is a long run challenge, and it's not going away anytime soon. But it should leave us a little sobered and a little concerned, precisely because it goes beyond a single individual. The second question on the defense budgets, I'd make 2 points there. One, the Chinese defense budget is actually much bigger than we think. And it may be actually, I don't think it equals the US defense budget, but it's not unreasonable to think of it being at least 2/3 the size of the US defense budget. And given that China's ambitions are more local, at least for the moment, the Chinese could use their defense budget in ways that are much more effective than we are. And you're absolutely right. We haven't made the investments that we ought to. And my fear is that between the costs of US defense labor, our personnel costs, between the costs of healthcare, and between the operations accounts, which are driven by our engagement in areas of the world that in many ways I think are not central to our interests, the pressures on the defense budget are going to be extremely serious, even if we can sustain current numbers. And I don't believe we can sustain those numbers. So there are structural problems with the defense budget, which leave me concerned about our capacity to maintain the global presence and the global advantages that we currently have. On the first question that you raised, which is the last one I'm answering, the issue of the US currency, that's absolutely correct. But what does that actually mean? What that actually means is that we can borrow endlessly without having near-term crises. I mean, that's really what a reserve currency gives you. It gives you, the exorbitant privilege of being able to enjoy lots of things with other people paying for them. But the bills come due at some point, right? The bills come due at some point. And how we manage those bills are really what is at issue. And if we end up using a lot of our external borrowings to finance current consumption, as opposed to investing in the long-term sources of our productivity and innovation, then simply having the world's reserve currency becomes a decaying asset. Yes, it gives you the latitude to tide over hard times, but it could contain the sources of its own undoing. And that is really what is something that we ought to worry about. And to the degree that the debt matters. I'm not a debt and deficit hawk, by any means, but I want to, if we are running up deficits, if we are running up debts, I prefer that we do this because we are spending on the long-term sources of our innovation and not just using borrowed money to finance current consumption. And it looks like we are doing exactly the opposite of what we ought to be.
Ashley, thank you. And Bill, thanks for that. I have an observation, a question, and then I'm going to get David Kraemer back in, and then we'll go to Nicholas and Rich Kraemer, and we'll see where we are. The observation is on part of Bill's question, which you took on head on, Ashley, on competence in government. I want to mention, if I may, that we hosted a pretty good Zoom conversation 2 weeks ago with Phil Zelikow, who is an academic historian, served in different administrations. A number of you know him or know him well. And he spoke to the issue of restoring competence in public policy and government. And he argued, as you suggested, Ashley, this is a problem that's been long in coming, and there are no short-term fixes. Danielle, if you have Phil Zelikow's article, and if you have the Zoom conversation, if you're able to circulate that to our colleagues in the next 20 minutes, Tamir, you can assist or guide on that. That would be wonderful, because Phil has published on this and spoke to this issue with us. The other thing I wanted to do, not to take away the microphone from Ashley for too long, just a moment maybe, is Giselle Donnelly's on the line. Gary Schmidt was, I don't know if he's still here, on the question of defense spending and budget, which has been identified as a very big challenge for a number of reasons. But this has to be succinct. It can't be 5 minutes. It needs to be 2 minutes. Giselle or Gary, Giselle, I do see you there. You have been arguing, I believe, for some time and pre-Donald J. Trump that we're not spending sufficiently and on the right things if we're projecting ahead in terms of a long-term strategic competition with China. Can you speak to that? Do I have you right? What's to be said about that right now in problems we've been accumulating over some years?
Well, since I've repeated myself for 40 years now, yeah, it'd be very difficult for me to walk away from that. Look, I think Ashley got it quite correct. And let me apologize, I just got the time wrong. If you keep changing the times of these things, it's hard for an old person to keep up. But the one thing I would add, though, is that, or question Ashley about, is whether the distinction between, I mean, as a global power, we have a lot of compelling interests. Our inability to walk away from the Middle East, for example, which is always everybody's favorite candidate for throwing a strategic interest out of the boat. At this point, I mean, at some point we have to look at how we behave rather than how our analysis would lead us. And so we're not unlike the British in the 1920s. We have an empire, so to speak, to maintain, and those are legitimate strategic interests, especially for a global power. So China has the ability to focus on a much narrower set of problems than do we, but conversely, and certainly we have the resources to walk and chew gum at the same time. But as Ashley quite rightly said, we're spending such a large slice of federal spending, and as he said, much of our borrowing goes to offset the baby boomer benefits that people like me are entirely entitled to. So you get what you pay for. At the end of the day, we could make slight reforms that make things better. But the illusion that we can pivot away from global interests and that there are silver bullet answers, technological answers or operational concepts that will easily and cheaply solve our problems, I think is an illusion.
So Giselle, thank you. Ashley, hold your fire for just one moment. Forgive my lack of courteousness. You will have ample time. I want to go back to David and then give you the floor, Ashley, and then we'll take 2, maybe even 3 more questions. David Kraemer?
Thanks, Jeff. My question, actually, my next question is follows on what you responded to about Bill Hill's question on deficits and debt. And if I remember right, China owns roughly 5%, give or take, of the U.S. debt. So my question is, as someone who's not an economist or understands all these issues terribly well, does our deficit spending that we have just gone through with, what, $3 trillion more, do we put ourselves in a more vulnerable position to the possibility that China will look to own more of that debt? Is that a point of leverage for China and a point of weakness for us? Thanks.
So let me start with David's and then I'll address Giselle's question. The fact that we are building up the deficit and by extension the debt gives China no leverage at all. Even with the multi-trillion stimulus packages that we're going to have to pay for over time, because the bulk of our debt is held by US citizens. So in effect, what the debt is doing is there is an intergenerational transfer of wealth. We are essentially financing current consumption by burdening our heirs. And that's, in some sense, you know, it always happens. You're always rolling debt. I mean, countries always do this, right? The real question to my mind is the debt being incurred on investments that over a period of time will yield greater than proportionate returns, so that our heirs, when it comes time to pay off this debt, will actually have the resources to do so without compromising their standards of living and their ways of life. And thus far, I'm pessimistic about that, because our debt is not going into financing the sources of long-term innovation, which would provide for wealth creation over generations. And that has to do with the character of the welfare state we've created, our inability to finance our own expenses, and so on and so forth. So the threat is not because China owns that debt. In fact, foreigners who own our debt, essentially, you know, all they are carrying are pieces of paper with pictures of dead presidents. But we are enjoying actually the fruits of that in terms of current consumption today. So it's not the foreign problem, it's a deeper problem that affects us. To Giselle's point, Giselle, I agree with you completely. We can't, as a great power, as a hegemonic power, sort of make the decision to sort of leave parts of the world or sort of treat them as irrelevant to our interests. But it does put a premium on how we use certain instruments that may be more expensive or less expensive for dealing with areas of the world that may not be our core interests. I mean, the British debate in the 1920s was actually extraordinary, because the British realized they didn't have the resources to maintain that empire, and so put a huge premium on political and diplomatic solutions in lieu of military solutions in peripheral areas of the world. Now, sometimes they were successful, sometimes they were not. But the lesson that I take away from our challenges is that we have to be very careful about a ready use of military instruments. That is, we cannot treat every problem like a nail which requires a military hammer. And that requires political discipline, that requires intellectual discipline to do the triage about our interests, the hierarchy of our interests, and so on and so forth. And so that is what I would like to see, you know, as we go forward, precisely because resources are going to be constrained.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to Nicholas.
Thank you. I'd like to get back on the topic of what you mentioned a bit earlier about how a potential boost in the welfare state will have an inverse effect on our potential to project power. How is it that we can compensate for this? Do we readjust our own defense spending? Is it to further push our traditional allies? Or would we look to engage new players to become actors on the world stage?
You know, the short and cheap answer is you have to do all of the above, because they're not going to be able to pick and choose. But let me say 2 or 3 things that address that question. First, as we rejigger the welfare state, we need to make certain that the expansion in welfare is really focused on increasing our productivity, because that's what makes welfare pay for itself over the long term, right? So we've got to focus on productivity investments as we expand this welfare state. So that's point number one. Point number two, with respect to global responsibility, we're going to have no alternative but to rely on partners. And this can be both a combination of existing partners as well as new partners out there who benefit from the US order. I mean, one of the things that, the simple mathematics of the global distribution of power tells us is that if US relative power is going to diminish, and it is somewhere between 18% and 15% of global GDP today, it may hover at that point for the next several years, or it may diminish even further. What that tells us is that we cannot maintain sort of the American empire simply on the strength of our own unilateral efforts. We're going to have to rely more and more on this coalition of partners that we have. And the good news is that the Western coalition, in the broadest sense of the word, has anywhere between 50 to 65% of global GDP. So there is absolutely no reason why, if we were to invest in greater alliance management and greater alliance cohesion, why we could not bring to bear more resources for sort of imperial purposes, if you were, using coalitions rather than attempting to do it unilaterally. And so that has to be the second thrust, which is why in the piece I emphasized, the question of not treating alliances cavalierly and so on and so forth. And then the third thing, which is the more longer term question, is we have to go back to investing in innovation. To my mind, that is the long-term solution. If we can sustain the United States as the center for global innovation, that's how you enjoy sort of supernormal returns to investment, and you get the resources to expand your defense budget and so on and so forth. Now, one of the crazy things that we've discovered in the last 20 or 25 years, and the work of Rob Gordon and others, is that productivity increases in the United States are not occurring at the level that we need, or at least at the level commensurate with our obligations. And this is a source of worry. Now, this is a huge debate in the economic literature about whether this is true or not. But if you assume for the moment that it is, then it gives you some pause, because it simply means that we will not have the resources to do the things that we have done for the last 70 years, more or less on the strength of our own unilateral capacities, which then takes us back to the alliance argument, once again, in a far more serious way than just simply the politics of managing alliances.
Good. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Ashley. So we're into the home stretch, and we'll keep everybody and Ashley on time. Rich Kraemer, you're on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation, your article today, Ashley.
Thank you.
We've seen recently in a somewhat well-publicized Pew poll, and just as a sense over the past year or so, that there's an increasing perception amongst Americans, both regular Americans and elected leadership, that China is a real threat, that it's a genuine adversary. And I'd like to, there's advantages and there are dangers in that. And with that, I'd like to hear, if you were in a conversation with an elected American leader that is focused on maintaining American hegemony, how would you talk to that leader? What would you advise that leader about how to catalyze this sentiment for the betterment of America without, say, descending into Chinese bashing? It's a very difficult line to straddle, but I struggle with it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you would advise in that situation.
Rich, thank you. And Ashley, before you respond, I want to work in a final question from Arch Puddington. Let's get yours in, Arch, and we'll give Ashley a chance to respond to both.
So I'd like to ask our speaker whether his emphasis on efficiency in our investments would that not contribute to the economic problems that we have that have also triggered this political polarization that we're experiencing now. And in fact, we're experiencing it in relationship to how the country responds to the COVID virus.
Hey, Jeff, can I throw in a real quick one?
David, real quick.
Sorry, I don't mean to abuse this, but how big a mistake Ashley was withdrawing from TPP?
Okay, that's
Great questions.
That's a question that's easy to answer. I think it was a very big mistake because even as we are retrenching from interdependence with China, our own growth requires us to be able to substitute that interdependence with China with interdependence with others. And the best strategy to manage interdependence in a world of great power competition is to narrow the chains of interdependency to your friends. Because that way you get the benefits of trade, you overcome the disadvantages of autarky, but you're not empowering your enemies to grow at the rate that you could because of your dependence on your friends. So the issue with TPP was a big, big mistake, and hopefully will be corrected at some point in the future. That's a good segue actually to address Archer's question. You're absolutely right, Arch, that a narrow-minded focus on efficiency gets us to exactly where we are today, which is large portions of our country, which haven't benefited from that efficiency, then rebel against the system that produced that efficiency. But to my mind, that is a testimony to the failure of our political system, where even as we were enjoying efficiency gains from increased interdependence and trade, including with China, we did not create the mechanisms that allowed those who were losing out of that process to stay into the game. And that is an internal deficiency within the United States. It's not a problem in international trade. Everyone knows the gains from trade are never shared equally within a country. Some constituencies do better than others. So the question, if you want to sustain the system, has to be some transfer payments. You've got to find some way of doing transfer payments between those who are gaining disproportionately to those who are losing out. And the fact that we have not created these adequate transfer payments essentially has put us in the situation today where large numbers of our citizens who have lost out are now are seeking to sort of overthrow the regime of interdependence, lock, stock, and barrel. But that's not a solution either, because if you end up in a world of greater autarky or complete autarky, then you're simply not going to have the resources required to help this disadvantaged cohort in your own population. So the real solution is really a Goldilocks sort of thing. You have to figure out how much interdependence is good for you from both an economic perspective and a political perspective. And there's no magical solution there. But so far, we've ended up in a problem because we've allowed economics to sort of overwhelm the politics, and we haven't made the political calls with respect to addressing how much interdependence is really useful or how we manage that interdependence in ways that advance our interests. The question that was asked first about how do we manage China as an adversary, I think we have to first start off by recognizing that China is not going to be an adversary of the kind that the Soviet Union was. It was easy to mobilize the United States against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was a palpable military threat to all the nations on its periphery. I think the Chinese are going to be much smarter than the Soviets were on this count. They're going to target certain rivals and use their power against certain rivals, but they will do their damnedest to prevent being seen as a revisionist power through and through, and certainly as a revisionist power that threatens the system as a whole. That means it's going to be hard to do national mobilization against China as a singular adversary. And as long as there is some interdependence with China, and I don't think we will be able to eliminate interdependence with China altogether, simply because the logic of technology and the logic of economics is going to push us in that direction. I mean, we'll be able to modulate it somewhat, but we're not going to be able to eliminate it, simply as a matter of state choice. That means that China is going to be a frenemy. It's going to be an adversary, even as we continue to have deep economic links with it, which means our capacity for competing with China is going to require much more subtle strategies. And to my mind, there are three elements that we need to focus on. First, we need to make certain that there are alternative sources of economic benefit to the United States beyond China. And this is where interdependence with our allies becomes critical. TPP, TTIP, any other arrangement that you can create to get the gains of trade from your friends rather than from your enemies is huge. And that's what we need to be doing. Two, we need to be focusing on maintaining our power projection capabilities, because that's really what makes the difference to our global standing. And we have to invest in power projection more than anything else, an effective power projection in the face of Chinese modernization and so on and so forth. And third, we have to go back to the point I made earlier, which is reinvest in the sources of American innovation, be much more serious about constraining technology that goes out of the United States, things that we actually did quite well during the Cold War through the COCOM regime. We've got to go back to a serious management of US generated technology, especially with respect to, to our competitors. And this we can do even as we remain interdependent with them. So if we continue to remain interdependent with China and rely on them for, $2 plastic toys, I don't care. But if interdependence means that the Chinese have access to the crown jewels of US technology, if they're able to access, intangible US knowledge that is cutting edge at the, edge of the, at the edge of innovation, those are things that I do worry about. And so we need to at least think of these three baskets in a way that we have not done for the last 30 years, so at least since 1991. Now, this is by no means a complete answer, but at least I hope I've sort of put out there the building blocks. I mean, the last point I want to make, though, is that we need to help American policymakers understand that the competition with China is going to be a mixed-sum game. It's not going to be a zero-sum game of the kind that we had with the Soviet Union. And if we fail to recognize that fact, we'll end up weakening our economic capabilities, and in the long run, being unable to compete with China effectively.
Ashley, thank you so much. Parenthetically, I do want to mention, because a decent part of this conversation has been about resources and financing. I can't resist but advertise to you all that we're interviewing today Larry Summers on how do we finance our future. And for those interested, so read that next week online on TAI. And then Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, thanks to our colleague Craig Kennedy, we have a Zoom conversation by a figure coming from the private sector, but devoting most of his time on how do we tackle debt and deficits. That's Paul Stebbins, and thank you for that, Craig. But Ashley, thank you. Wow, that was 59 minutes to knock someone's socks off and give us, all a chance to go read more and do a lot more homework. So thanks to everybody for coming and participating. What a fine conversation. And Ashley, Godspeed, more soon, and let's hope in person.
I hope so. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jeff. It's a pleasure.
Great
pleasure.
to see you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.